Human beings are immensely complex. You know it and I know it, and so did early psychologists, especially the formative period when a lot of the theorists were doing their work around the 30s and 40s. And what they came up with was that we're so darn complex that figuring out why we do things is really tough. What's going on in the mental processes, you just have a hard time figuring out. As a matter of fact, one important theorist came to the conclusion that we could do without trying to theorize about all of that stuff and just do whatever we can observe. And what we can observe is what's important. And of course, when you're talking about observation and observing people doing things, you're talking about B.F. Skinner. And that's what he came to the conclusion of. As a matter of fact, if you read his important books, Walden 2 and Beyond Freedom and Dignity, you'll find out that he really constructs a whole society, or at least in his mind, based on the fact that we don't need to bother with mental construct or mentalistic constructs, which is what he called freedom and dignity, things that you can't really quantify. What were useful to him were things that you could see, things you could observe, things you could tell that were happening. That was what was important. And it all started because when he was learning about psychology, he began observing. He began observing the lab animals, the rats, and some of his favorites were pigeons, in doing the little exercises that he had learned from his progenitors, namely Watson and before him Pavlov. And we'll talk about Pavlov in a little while. But Skinner was especially interested in the fact that in classical behavioral psychology, that is, that Watson, by way of Pavlov, came across, Pavlov, you remember, noticed that when you were trying to study the digestion in dogs, as a matter of fact, that's what he got his Nobel Prize for, when you rang a bell to tell the dog that it was time to eat, the dog would start to salivate. Pavlov wondered if you rang the bell without feeding them after a while, would they still salivate? And of course we all know that the dog did do that. By the way, just a little known fact, Pavlov could tell that the dog was salivating because he had actually surgically taken the salivary gland out of the dog so that he could more easily see it. So you could see it salivating because it was not on the inside of the dog anymore. Don't do that with your subjects. But he noticed that the bell, and he called that conditioned response. You condition the response to happening because dogs don't normally do that. Skinner wondered if there wasn't more intentionality to it, and so what he began to do was design experiments that showed that you could get rats to do things that you had reinforced them to do. As a matter of fact, he called them reinforcers. And that operating on your environment, doing one thing like pushing a bar and getting a food pellet, was called an operant. The thing you did was called the operant, so that the operant behavior modification was when you got them to do the thing you wanted to do, they were conditioned to continue doing it if they got the positive reinforcement in doing it. So he continued to do that. As a matter of fact, he designed special boxes called Skinner boxes that he put these rats in, that they began to go around their routines, and he found out that he could modify the rat's behavior in several different ways through the positive response. As a matter of fact, what he said was, a behavior followed by a reinforcing stimulant results in an increased probability of that behavior occurring in the future. And if you want to stop a behavior, that is, called extinction, then what do? A behavior no longer followed by a reinforcing stimulus results in a decreased probability of that behavior occurring in the future. That is, you could not only build in a response to where they'll push the bar, but you could actually build out the response to where they quit pushing the bar. So you could build it in, you could build it out. One of the big things that he noticed, as a matter of fact, that it was not only important how you did it, but that you could get them to do it based on various schedules of reinforcement, so that you could continuously reinforce it. Every time the rat pushes the bar, he gets a pellet. There could be a fixed ratio of reinforcement. every 3 times the rat pushes the bar, he gets a pellet. Or that it could be a fixed interval of schedules. Every 3rd time and then 20 seconds later, the pellet comes. Or some schedule like that. And then finally, there could even be a variable schedule so that you could do it 7 times, 10 times, 20 times, and so on. And you could find ways in which they still would be conditioned for the response even within the schedule, so it didn't have to be a direct one-to-one correlation. He even found out that it was possible to get the rats and pigeons to do more complex tasks by a method he called shaping. That is, you began to do the first task, which was a simple thing that a pigeon might normally do, like to push a bar, and then you could get it to push the bar twice, and then you could get it to push a bar shaped like a bowling ball, and then after 10 or 20 tries of doing this, you finally have a pigeon bowling, which was one of his favorite things to show. But you didn't do it all at once. You did it little by little. But by doing that operant conditioning, and he called it a method of successive approximations, you could get a complex behavior out of a real simple transaction of stimulus response. So he was able to take his ideas of operant conditioning and move it into a larger realm, which is really what gave him the thought to talk about shaping society and teaching children through the same behavior modification by doing the successive approximations on a larger societal scale. So he imagined this sort of psychology as being useful in a broad range. Obviously, not everyone agreed with him. Now, where does punishment fit in? He called that aversive stimulus. That is something that would be the opposite of a reinforcer. A behavior followed by an aversive stimulus is a decreased probability of the behavior occurring in the future. In other words, that is known as punishment. Now, he didn't think punishment was good, not because there were any moral qualities to it. He didn't really think in terms of moral qualities. He didn't think punishment worked well because it just didn't work as well. If you did positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, that is taking away the reinforcer, he found that that worked better than doing the positive punishment, or even after you began punishing somebody, taking away the punishment, which would be negative punishment. Now, try to keep those ideas separate, because in the test, positive and negative reinforcement is different than positive and negative punishment. Negative reinforcement is not the same as positive punishment. But if you think about one being a positive thing that you can take away and one being a negative thing that you can give or take away, it'll help keep those separate in your mind. So that when you're looking at Skinner, you're thinking about mainly behavior modification. As a matter of fact, he used it so much that he even called it BMOD as a shorthand way of talking about the behavior modification. And people have taken that, and you'll hear sometimes even behavior modification talked in terms of a token economy. That is, say in a prison or in a self-contained school, in order to get the behaviors that you want out of people, you actually start an economy based on tokens or script or things that people want that they can trade for things that they desire. So that if you get 10 tokens, you get a packet of gum or something like that. And in this token economy, it's based solely on the idea of behavior modification, that you're giving the tokens to reinforce the behaviors that you want out of those people. And in that way, you could design society the way you wanted it. So, B.F. Skinner, you'll want to be thinking in terms of behavior modification, operant conditioning, that is, getting people to do the operations that you want them to do through the behavior modification. That extinction is getting the behavior to go away. And the schedules of reinforcement, that is, continuous, fixed ratio, fixed interval, and variable schedule reinforcing. And the idea of shaping, that is, taking a simple task and making it successively more complicated to get the behavior that you want. That's B.F. Skinner and how we got to him through Mr. Pavlov, and that's what you need to know. Good luck.